My husband called me while I was visiting a client in another state and said, "I'm divorcing you and I've already sold the house." He even laughed, the kind of laugh that tells you he's not just ending a marriage, he's enjoying the destruction. I kept my voice calm. But what he didn't know was that the house he sold wasn't really his to sell. Before the phone call that rewrote her life, before betrayal grew teeth and learned her name, Claire believed she knew the shape of her world. It was a modest world. Nothing extravagant, nothing loud, but it carried the kind of quiet that makes mornings feel like promises. A hardwood floor that creaked only in familiar places. A kitchen window that welcomed sunrise like an old friend. A house that had become a diary written without ink. Claire wasn't the kind of woman who needed applause to feel real. She liked things that endured. The smell of rosemary on her fingertips after tending her garden. The comforting hum of her old sedan when it warmed in winter. The soft knock her husband, Mark, used to give before entering her home office, as if respect was a habit he didn't want to lose. But habits change and respect evaporates when resentment begins to simmer beneath smiles. Back then, Claire couldn't see the shift clearly, only felt it like a faint tremor beneath the floorboards. Mark had started coming home later, as though time owed him a debt. His jokes became sharper, aimed more often at her than at life. And he moved through rooms like a man listening for applause that never came. Still, Claire tried, as she always had, to strengthen the places where their marriage felt thin. Work became her anchor. As a real estate consultant, she traveled often, stitching deals together with precision. Clients trusted her because she didn't sell dreams. She translated them. And she loved that, helping people find spaces that felt like possibility wrapped in brick and light. It reminded her of her mother who used to say, "A home is a promise you build with yourself first." She carried those words into adulthood like a lantern. The week everything changed, Claire had flown out to Arizona to consult for a longtime client, a widower selling his ranch. The trip was routine, the kind that came with predictable conversations about escrow and soil condition. But beneath the routine, Claire felt a knot forming in her stomach. Not dread exactly. Something quieter. Something like the whisper before a storm introduces itself. Mark barely texted that week. Not unusual but not comforting either. His messages when they came were clipped, "Okay. Sure. Whatever." The kind of replies that make silence feel generous. Claire told herself she'd bring it up when she returned. She rehearsed lines in her head, soft ones, patient ones, hoping to find the version of herself he used to hear without irritation. But life, with its strange timing and cruel sense of irony, had different plans. That Friday, Claire finished her client meeting early. She stepped outside into the desert air, heavy with heat and the smell of dust rising from the earth. Her phone buzzed in her hand. Mark's name flashed on the screen. She smiled faintly, relieved. Maybe he missed her. Maybe he wanted to soften whatever unnamed tension had been building between them. She answered with a gentle, "Hey, you okay?" What came next was a sound she hadn't heard in years, Mark laughing. Not kindly, not warmly, but with the ugly tone people get when they mistake cruelty for power. "Claire," he said, breathless with amusement, "I'm divorcing you. And I've already sold the house." The words slapped the air between them. For a moment, her brain couldn't decide whether to process the sentence or the laugh. Both hurt in different ways. "I'm starting my life with my new girlfriend," he continued, still laughing. "Enjoy finding a new place. You've got what, a few days? Maybe a week. I'm sure you'll land on your feet. You always do." Around her blurred, distant cars, dry wind, voices in the parking lot, everything faded into a strange tunnel of disbelief. People talk about their heart dropping into their stomach. Claire's felt as if it had fallen clean through her body and disappeared into the dust. But her voice, her calm, steady voice, betrayed none of it. "Sounds good," she replied, as if he had merely asked her to pick up milk on her way home. Because Claire had learned something long ago. People who want to hurt you look for the wound. People who want to control you look for your fear. And people who laugh while destroying you are ready to hear you break. So she refused to break. When she ended the call, her hand trembled, but her breath remained even, anchored by something she hadn't felt in years, clarity. Mark thought he had detonated her life. He thought selling the house would leave her scrambling, desperate, defeated. But what he didn't know, what he had never bothered to understand, was that the house he sold wasn't actually his to sell. It never had been. And the moment she boarded her flight home, Claire felt something shift inside her. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something deeper, something older than marriage or betrayal, the rising awareness that she had been underestimating herself as much as Mark had. She would walk into her home one last time, not as the wife he tried to discard, but as the woman he had foolishly underestimated. And what happened next would wipe the smile off his face so completely that even memory wouldn't dare bring it back, because the truth waiting for him wasn't just surprising. It was devastating. The flight home felt longer than any journey Claire had ever taken, not because of the miles, but because of the thoughts that refused to sit still. The cabin hummed with the low murmur of strangers and recycled air, but inside her, another kind of weather brewed. Rage tried to rise, a hot, crackling thing, but something wiser kept it at bay. Not yet, it whispered. Not before you remember the whole story. So she let her mind do what it always had when life felt unbearable. It rewound. Back to the beginning. Back to the house. The first time she saw it, it wasn't beautiful. The shingles were tired, the lawn patchy, the front steps uneven like teeth in need of braces. But there was good bone beneath the wear, a kind of quiet dignity that some buildings carry the way people carry hope. She had stood at the front gate with her father that afternoon, sun slanting across the crooked porch, while he said in that low, certain voice of his, "It's not much yet, but it will be. For you." She had been 24, newly married, still wearing the glow of wedding vows like perfume. Mark had been charming then, full of plans and possibilities, the kind of man who could talk you into believing the future would unfold exactly as he pictured it. But the house hadn't come from Mark. It had come from her father, who'd spent 35 years fixing other people's homes, and wanted his only daughter to have one that didn't depend on anyone's mood. He signed the deed in a lawyer's office that smelled faintly of leather and dust, his hands still carrying traces of paint and plaster. Claire remembered the way he'd squared his shoulders when the attorney slid the papers across the desk. "Just her?" the lawyer had asked, glancing at Mark. "Just her," her father had said. "Gift. No liens, no partners." Mark had laughed it off then, made some joke about the ladies conspiring against him, and kissed the top of Claire's head. She'd flushed with embarrassment and gratitude all at once, not realizing her father was quietly building her a lifeboat in case the marriage ship ever forgot how to float. Years later, when her father died, that memory would return with a new sharpness. But on the plane now, it came as a reminder. This house had never been Mark's prize. It had been her inheritance, her safety net, her proof that she could belong somewhere, even if everyone else walked away. So how could he have sold it? The question looped in her mind as the seatbelt sign blinked on and the plane began its slow descent. People around her shifted, checked their phones, reached for bags. Lives ready to resume. Claire sat very still, hands folded, and replayed his exact words in her head. "I've already sold the house." He didn't say our, not once. She noticed that now. He claimed the house with his tongue the way thieves claim wallets on crowded trains. Fast. Casual. Entitled. But entitlement wasn't ownership. She closed her eyes and pictured the last time they had talked seriously about finances. It had been almost 2 years ago, at that very same kitchen table he now believed he'd evicted her from with a phone call. The sun had been gentle that afternoon, filtering through sheer curtains, turning dust into glitter. Mark had wanted to refinance. "Rates are low," he'd said. "We'd be stupid not to use the equity." She'd hesitated, fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug. "My father paid for this place in cash," she'd reminded him softly. "No mortgage. No debt. It's the one thing in our life that's clean." He'd rolled his eyes. "Exactly. It's dead money, Claire. We could leverage it. Expand. Maybe finally get that beach condo. Why keep all that value locked up just to brag that we don't owe anyone?" But she hadn't cared about bragging rights. She cared about the feeling of standing on a floor that no bank could snatch from under her. She'd asked the lawyer to join them on a conference call just to be sure. And that's when the finer ink of her father's foresight had revealed itself. "The deed is solely in Claire's name," the lawyer had explained. "Any new loan or transfer would require her explicit consent and signature. The property cannot be sold or encumbered without her involvement." Mark had gone quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't mean agreement, only delayed resistance. Back then she hadn't pressed. She'd been relieved. Said, "We'll figure out another way to get your beach condo." And he'd smiled back, but there'd been something brittle in it. Something that now on the plane she finally recognized for what it was, resentment. She had married a man who loved the idea of security, as long as he was the one holding the keys. The wheels hit the runway with a jolt, pulling her out of herself. As the plane taxied, Claire's phone came alive with notifications. Voicemails. Messages. A few from Mark, shorter now, less amused. One from an unknown number. And one from her neighbor Mia, a woman whose gossip usually came in the form of "just so you know." She didn't listen yet. Not until she'd collected her suitcase and stepped into the pale light of the arrivals hall. Not until she'd found a quiet corner by a vending machine and allowed herself to exhale. The first voicemail was Mark again, sounding irritated that she hadn't reacted the way he'd rehearsed. "Did you seriously just say sounds good? Claire, this isn't a joke. The house is already in escrow. I needed liquidity. You'll get your portion, don't freak out. Just don't do anything stupid. I'll send over the papers. And don't bother calling my lawyer. This is happening." He hung up. No goodbye. No apology. Just a man narrating his version of reality. The next message was shorter, left an hour after the first. "You know what? Stay with your clients a while if you want. I'm kind of busy this weekend anyway." Busy, she thought. With her. The unnamed new girlfriend. The one he was so sure was the next chapter, not a footnote. She skipped ahead to Mia's voicemail. Her neighbor's voice came through in a hurried whisper, like she was reporting from a crime scene. "Claire, hey, it's Mia. I just saw a moving truck outside your place. And Mark was there with, I guess that's the girlfriend? She's very young. They were bringing in boxes. I thought you were at this, okay? I'm worried." Something inside Claire went still at that. Not rage. Not grief. Just a cold, clear stretch of determination. He hadn't just sold the house in his head. He was trying to occupy it in her absence. Moving his new life into the space her father had given her. He had mistaken her silence for surrender. She didn't cry at the airport. Didn't pace or rant or call him back to scream. Instead, she opened her notes app and started typing, each line more measured than the last. Lawyer's name. Deed details. Father's bequest. Escrow laws. Unauthorized signatures. She thought of her old mentor, an older woman in real estate who used to tell her, "Emotion can get you to the door, but paperwork determines who owns the key." On the ride home, the city blurred past the cab window. Streetlights smeared into vertical lines. Neighbors' houses glowed with the soft, ordinary drama of family dinners and television chatter. Claire watched it all as if from the outside of a life she used to think she'd live forever. She allowed herself exactly one memory of Mark that made her chest ache. The night he'd proposed years ago on a bridge that overlooked the river. He'd been nervous then, hands shaking, voice breaking when he said he couldn't imagine a future that didn't have her in it. She had believed him. Maybe on that night he had even believed himself. But somewhere along the way, the man who once feared losing her had become the man who staged her abandonment like a celebration. The cab slowed as they turned onto her street. Her house, no matter what he believed, she still called it that in her mind, came into view. The porch light was on, but not in the warm, welcoming way she knew. Boxes were stacked on the steps. A car she didn't recognize sat in the driveway, red and glossy and smug. She paid the driver, stepped out, and felt the cool crush of familiarity under her feet, the sidewalk remembering her weight. Every instinct in her screamed to push the door open, storm in and demand answers. Instead, she paused at the gate, fingers resting on the metal latch, and inhaled. This was still Act 1 in his mind. The grand reveal. The moment he watched her crumble so he could feel taller. But Claire wasn't interested in being part of his theater. She would walk in. She would let him show off. She would listen to his rehearsed cruelty, hear all about the new start, the better fit, the fresh chapter. She would even let him enjoy, for a brief moment, the illusion that he had already won. Because buried under the sting of betrayal, another memory had surfaced. A document signed 3 years ago that he had barely read. A small, boring thing he'd brushed aside, trusting her to handle the details like she always did. The day they'd updated their wills. Claire pushed the gate open. Gravel whispered under her shoes. From inside she heard laughter, Mark's, and a higher, younger tone woven through it. glass clinked. Music played low in the background, like the soundtrack to someone else's life. She climbed the steps slowly, each one a drumbeat of something gathering inside her. He thought the house was his stage. He was about to learn it had been her fortress all along. And if he had truly sold something today, it wasn't the home her father left her. It was his own future. He just didn't know it yet. Claire stood at the threshold for a moment that lasted longer than time. It wasn't hesitation. It wasn't fear. It was something older, a ritual pause, like a woman taking one final breath before descending into the ocean of truth waiting below. Her hand rested on the doorknob, and for the first time since that call, she let herself feel the weight of everything she had carried alone. Inside, the lights poured warmth across the walls, the furniture, the framed photos she had chosen, but none of it belonged to the moment anymore. A stranger's laughter spilled out from the living room. Mark's deeper voice rose next, coated in self-satisfaction. A man hosting a celebration of his own betrayal. Claire turned the knob slowly and stepped inside. The air smelled different. A new perfume lingered, artificial sweetness and cheap ambition. Her eyes swept the entryway. Boxes marked her clothes and bathroom were stacked neatly. A pair of glossy heels she had never worn sat beside the shoe rack. A jacket that didn't belong to her hung on the hook where she used to hang her scarves. The house felt invaded. Not by burglars but by someone who thought possession was the same as belonging. Claire didn't speak immediately. She moved through the hall like someone returning to a museum of memories that had been vandalized overnight. The framed photo of her and her father, the one from the day he handed her the deed, had been turned face down almost deliberately. A subtle cruelty. A quiet attempt at erasure. In the living room, Mark sprawled on the couch like a king surveying a kingdom he hadn't built. Beside him lounged a young woman, early 20s maybe, legs crossed, sipping wine Claire had purchased. The woman giggled, touching Mark's thigh lightly, the way someone does when they want to be seen enjoying someone else's downfall. Mark turned when he heard Claire's footsteps. He didn't hide his smile. It was the same smug grin he had worn during the phone call. "There she is," he said, voice dripping with mock surprise. "Look who finally decided to come home." Claire didn't react. She simply stood there, tall, composed, the quiet storm of composure that grows from betrayal that has ripened too long. The girlfriend glanced at Claire with an expression that tried to be sympathetic but failed miserably. It had the brittle confidence of someone who had been fed a one-sided story. Someone who believed she was stepping into the role of hero, rather than antagonist. Claire's gaze drifted to the coffee table. Papers sat neatly stacked, the alleged sale documents. She didn't touch them. Didn't need to. Because she already knew the truth. The man in front of her was holding a blade made of air, swinging it with theatrical confidence, unaware it had no weight. Mark leaned back, sipping from his glass, performing nonchalance. "So," he said, "before you start crying or ranting or whatever you plan, let me be clear. Everything is done. Over. Finalized. I needed the liquidity. And I'm not staying in this," he gestured around the room dismissively, "nostalgic shack any longer. We're upgrading. New place, new life, new chapter." Claire's heartbeat didn't spike. Her breath didn't catch. But a deeper ache unfurled, not because she believed him, but because she finally saw the man he had become with painful clarity. A man who mistook cruelty for freedom. A man who believed burning bridges made him powerful. A man who thought humiliation made him taller. The girlfriend leaned in, her voice soft but undeniably smug. "It's better this way," she said. "For all of us." Claire finally met her eyes. Not with venom. Not with condescension. But with the cold, clear understanding of someone looking at a child who wandered into traffic without knowing what cars were. She stepped further into the room, letting the moment build slowly. Her footsteps were measured, echoing slightly, the same floorboards her father had sanded smooth with his own hands. She remembered that day. He had wiped sweat from his brow and smiled at her, saying, "If you keep a floor strong, it holds the whole house. If you keep the truth strong, it holds your whole life." Mark watched her approach, expecting desperation, expecting tears, expecting surrender. What he didn't see, what he couldn't possibly understand, was the fire that had been gathering behind her calm since the moment he laughed on the phone. She walked toward the table, eyes drifting to the sale agreement. A neat stack. Too neat. Real estate documents never sat that perfectly. She almost smirked. He had staged them for effect, not for legality. She turned to him slowly. You sold the house, she said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't acceptance. It was the opening move. Mark grinned, triumphant in his delusion. Yes, he said. And I'd appreciate you not messing up the deal. I don't need your signature, by the way. There are ways around that. Claire breathed in through her nose, her posture softening, not in submission but in stillness. The kind of stillness that comes before lightning branches across the sky. She took one step closer. Mark, she said, her voice low, steady, calm in a way that should have terrified him, you can't sell what you don't own. His smirk didn't falter. Not yet. Claire, he said, laughing lightly, I know you're upset, and I get it, but don't embarrass yourself with legal talk. You don't understand how these things work. The girlfriend snorted into her wine glass. Claire didn't blink. Actually, she said, I understand exactly how they work. Because I'm the one who kept our finances in order. I'm the one who talked to the lawyers. I'm the one who knew what my father did when he signed this house over. Mark's smile cracked. A small fissure almost invisible. But she saw it. She stepped to the side, her hand gently touching the picture frame of her father, lifting it back upright. The motion was small, reverent. Do you know what my father told the lawyer the day he transferred the deed? She asked softly. Do you remember what he said when you asked why the house wasn't in both our names? Mark rolled his eyes. Claire. Stop, that was years ago. She didn't stop. He said, she continued, her voice now slow, deliberate, that this house was his gift to his daughter alone, and that it would remain hers, in all circumstances. Marriage, divorce, debt, crisis. It was to be changed. Not dramatically, not immediately, but something shifted behind his eyes. The slow dawning recognition of a man who suddenly felt the ground shifting beneath him. Claire picked up the stack of documents from the table. She didn't flip through them, just held them, feeling their weight or lack thereof. Do you know what happens, she said, when someone tries to sell a property they have no legal ownership of? Mark sat up slightly, a hint of uncertainty creeping into his posture. Claire, she placed the papers back on the table softly, aligning them with precision. The sale isn't valid, she said. The listing itself is illegal. And the realtor who accepted your signature? He's already under investigation. Because your signature on these documents, she lifted her gaze to his, eyes steady, is classified as fraud. The room tightened. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. The girlfriend blinked rapidly, confusion flickering across her features. Mark's face flushed. That's not Claire, stop being dramatic. But Claire wasn't finished. And as of this morning, she said calmly, my lawyer, the one you forgot I have, confirmed that any attempt to transfer or occupy this house without my consent qualifies as criminal trespassing. That includes you. And her. She nodded toward the girlfriend. Silence swallowed the room whole. For the first time, Mark's confidence faltered completely. The smile dissolved from his lips as the realization finally pierced through the armor of arrogance he had wrapped around himself. Claire stepped closer, not threatening but inevitable. You didn't just try to leave me, she said. You tried to erase me. You tried to uproot the last thing my father gave me. And you laughed while doing it. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't rise. It didn't break. It sharpened. You thought I would crumble. You thought I would beg. You thought I would disappear. Whispering, simply delivering truth with the precision of a blade. But Mark, I don't disappear. I endure. She straightened, letting the sentence settle into the walls, the floor, the air that had once felt like home. And now, she said, you are a guest here. The girlfriend's voice cracked the silence, high and fragile. Mark, what is she talking about? Mark didn't answer. Because deep down, in the place arrogance tries to drown truth, he knew. He had sold nothing. He owned nothing. He controlled nothing. And Claire was just beginning. For a long moment after Claire delivered the truth, the room felt suspended in a silence so sharp it could have sliced through bone. Not the silence of peace, but the silence that arrives when the universe waits for someone to admit that their empire was built on sand. Mark stared at her, eyes narrowing as if trying to recalibrate reality to something more flattering. But reality had stopped bending for him the second Claire walked in with a truth he neither expected nor respected. Claire didn't move. She stood rooted at the heart of her father's house, steady as the foundation he laid, shoulders aligned with quiet dignity. She felt no triumph, only inevitability, as though this moment had been walking toward her for years, patient and unassuming, waiting for her to catch up. Mark rose from the couch slowly, the way a guilty man rises when he realizes the stage lights aren't on his side. His posture tried to hold authority, but the edges were crumbling. The girlfriend watched him widen his stance, straighten his shirt, lift his chin. But even she could see it, the choreography of a man losing control. "Claire," he said, voice low with the strain of forced calm. "You're twisting things. You always do this. You always make yourself the victim." Claire blinked once slowly. She hadn't made herself anything. His choices had carved her into this version, but she still refused to let those define her. "You're not a victim," he continued, trying to regain footing. "You're just overreacting. Situations evolve. Relationships change. It's life." Claire felt the weight of those words, the casual way he dismissed the destruction he caused. She remembered all the nights she had waited for him to come home. All the mornings she'd swallowed her unease so he wouldn't feel judged. All the compromises she'd made, bending herself to fit inside his comfort even as he grew sharper at the edges. "Life didn't do this," Claire said softly. "You did." Mark's face twitched, a crack in the facade. But Claire wasn't speaking for him anymore. Her words were narrating the truth for herself, for the walls that had witnessed the erosion of her marriage, for the spirit of her father still living in the grain of the floorboards. She stepped away from the table and walked toward the window where sunlight still filtered through the curtains she had sewn years ago. Outside, the garden she had tended alone held its breath. The rosemary bushes her father helped her plant still stood tall, fragrant and steady. They had survived harsh winters and scorching summers. They had survived neglect when grief swallowed her after her father's death. And yet they stood stubborn, rooted, refusing to give up. Her father would have wanted her to do the same. Mark's voice broke through her thoughts, defensive now. "You can't seriously believe you can keep me out of this house. I lived here for years. I've paid bills. I've maintained things. That counts for something." Claire turned back toward him. His desperation hung in the air like humidity before a storm. "You lived here," she said. "But you never honored it. You never honored the man who gave it to us. And you never honored me." The girlfriend shifted uncomfortably. She had entered this story thinking she was stepping into a romance, a rescue, a ready-made life where she would be adored, admired, kept. But the atmosphere now pressed down on her, heavy, foreign. The reality she walked into no longer felt like a prize. Claire stepped closer, her voice becoming quieter, more intimate. Not because she feared confrontation but because truth doesn't need volume, it only needs presence. "You didn't just betray me," she said. "You betrayed the memory of the man who believed you'd protect what he built for me. You betrayed the home that held you when you were lost. You betrayed the version of yourself you promised to be." Mark looked away for a second, just long enough for the truth to land. Claire paused then, letting the weight settle between them like dust floating in slanted light. And then, something unexpected happened. Her mind drifted, not to anger but to memory. She recalled the winter after her father passed, when the heater died unexpectedly. She had been grieving, exhausted, brittle like dry leaves. Mark had come home frustrated after work. Instead of offering comfort, he had snapped at her, said she should have handled it herself because he'd had a long day. She remembered standing in the cold living room, wrapped in a blanket her father gave her, realizing something quietly devastating. She had married a man who wanted the image of partnership, but not the labor of it. Back then she had forced herself to forget that moment. Had buried it, excused it, made the wound smaller so she could survive her marriage. But moments like that don't disappear, they lodge themselves inside, waiting for the day you finally have enough courage to name them. Today was that day. Claire moved toward the shelves, running a finger over the photo frames, the ones Mark had avoided for years. Each picture carried a story. Her father hugging her at graduation. Her mother tying an apron around her as a child. Her dog, midnight black and joyful, who had passed during the first year of marriage. Not a single photo of Mark stood on that shelf. Not because she had forgotten, but because Mark had never wanted to be photographed in the moments that mattered. He only liked pictures taken when he felt successful or admired. Not quiet moments. Not vulnerable moments. Only curated ones. He had never truly lived in the home she built with her heart. Only passed through it like a guest who expected service. Claire turned back to him with that realization illuminating her posture. "This house was never your home," she said softly. "You lived here. But you never lived in it." Something inside Mark collapsed. The moment arrogance began to realize it had miscalculated. The girlfriend looked back and forth between them as if watching a bridge burn that she hadn't known she was standing on. Then Claire walked toward the hall, each step taking her deeper not into the house, but into herself, through the memories, the losses, the suppressed truths that were rising like floodwater after a long drought. She stopped at the doorway of the small room her father had once used as an office when he stayed with her after her mother died. The room still smelled faintly of paper, dust and cedar, the scent of safety. She had kept the desk exactly as it was, not out of reluctance to move on, but out of respect for the man who saved every penny to give her what she now stood inside. That room held the truth Mark didn't know existed. Slowly she opened the drawer. The one her father had locked and told her never to force open. Years later, after his passing, the lawyer had given her the key along with his final letter. Inside were the documents her father didn't want her to see until she needed them. The original deed. The trust agreement. The contingent clause. The clause that stated in clear language that if anyone, spouse or otherwise, attempted to sell the house without her written consent, the property would be legally frozen, and the offending party would be liable for fraud, damages and forfeiture of all marital property claims. A shield written in her father's hand. Designed for this exact moment. Claire traced the embossed seal on the paper, remembering the slow, deliberate way her father had pressed his thumb into it the day she received the keys. She remembered how he had kissed her forehead and whispered, "A good father protects his daughter long after his hands can't." She closed the drawer with reverence, not rage, and returned to the living room. Mark flinched when he saw what she held, as if papers could strike harder than fists. And perhaps they could. Because documents don't lie. They don't falter. They don't embellish or shift blame. They simply declare the truth in ink that never trembles. She placed the folder on the table with the gentle gravity of someone laying down evidence, not to punish but to illuminate. Mark swallowed hard. "What is that?" "The thing," Claire said. "You should have considered before you tried to rewrite my life." She didn't open the folder. She didn't need to. The presence of it alone was enough to destroy the performance he had prepared. Mark lunged for the papers on the table, the fake sale documents, grabbing them as if destroying them could rewrite the truth. He tore them, ripping them into frantic shreds. The girlfriend gasped, stepping back as pieces fluttered like dead butterflies to the floor. Claire watched without moving. "Destroying papers doesn't change legality," she said quietly. "It only exposes fear." He froze mid-rip, hands trembling. "Claire." But she wasn't done. "Mark," she said, "you didn't just make a mistake. You committed fraud. You falsified a signature. You attempted to sell a property you have zero legal standing to transfer. And you moved another woman into a house that legally recognizes her as an intruder." The girlfriend blanched, wine nearly slipping from her hand. Claire's voice softened into something even sharper, the softness of truth that cuts because it no longer needs to yell. "You wanted to start a new life," she said. "But you tried to build it on the ashes of mine." She walked toward the front door, not in retreat, but in action. "And now," she said, looking back at him with the quiet power of a woman reclaiming her story, "you are going to leave." Mark opened his mouth, fury rising, but Claire raised a hand gently, stopping him without force, simply with inevitability. "You will pack your things. Whatever you brought into this house leaves with you. Whatever you didn't bring," she glanced around the room, "stays, because you contributed none of it." She stepped forward. "And she," Claire added, nodding toward the girlfriend, "will leave too, quietly, because the police do not take kindly to criminal trespassing, especially when there are active fraud claims involved." The girlfriend looked horrified. "Mark, you said." But Mark didn't answer. Because the performance was over. The spotlight had shifted. The script had turned against him. Claire walked past him, headed toward her father's garden. She needed air, sunlight, scent, the things that grounded her. As she stepped outside, the earth welcomed her like a child finally returning home. She touched the rosemary leaves, letting them crumble softly between her fingers. The scent rose strong and clean, filling her lungs. Behind her, the door opened. Footsteps approached. But they weren't Mark's. They were the girlfriend's. She stopped a few feet away, her voice trembling. I didn't know. Claire didn't respond immediately. She let the girl's words float in the air, weighed down with regret and confusion. The girlfriend stepped closer. He told me the house was his. He said you were controlling. That you didn't love him anymore. That he deserved a fresh start. Claire listened. Not because she needed justification, but because truth deserves witnesses. The girl swallowed. I didn't come here to steal a home, she whispered. I thought I was stepping into something honest. Finally, Claire turned. You walked into a story without reading the chapters, she said. And the truth is your exit. The girl nodded slowly, tears forming. Not for the loss of Mark, but for the shame of being part of someone else's cruelty without realizing it. Claire didn't argue, didn't comfort, didn't lecture. Some lessons life teaches in whispers, others in storms. This one was a hurricane. Inside, Claire could hear Mark pacing, a trapped animal searching for an escape route that didn't exist. The house he thought he'd conquered had turned on him. The walls that once heard his voice echo with arrogance now held the quiet judgment of truth. He had played the role of conqueror. He was now learning he belonged to the conquered. Claire took one final breath in the garden, letting her father's legacy strengthen her spine. Then she walked back inside to watch the beginning of the end, not for her, but for the man who once believed he could dictate her destiny. Because Act 4 was not the climax. It was simply the unraveling, the undoing, the slow, inevitable collapse of a man who built his life on the illusion of control. And Claire was just beginning to rise. The sun was dipping beneath the horizon when Claire stepped back inside, leaving her father's rosemary garden behind. The light entering the house shifted into a long amber trail, stretching across the hardwood like a silent reminder that some homes remember their true owners, even when people forget them. The quiet inside was different now. Not hollow, not tense, but anticipatory, as though the house itself was waiting for justice to finish walking through its rooms. Mark stood near the mantel, hands on his hips, pacing in short, angry bursts. His confidence had drained from him like air from a punctured tire. His shoulders hung lower, his breath sharper, and something behind his eyes flickered with panic he couldn't camouflage. He looked less like the man who had taunted her on the phone, and more like a man whose illusions were drowning. Claire crossed the living room without rushing, her steps steady, deliberate. Every footfall echoed softly, as though the floorboards were aligning themselves with her, choosing their side in this fracture. Mark stopped pacing when he noticed her. His expression hardened, a last attempt at building walls he could hide behind. You're being unreasonable, he muttered, as if the phrase was an anchor he could throw into the tornado gathering around him. All of this drama, it isn't necessary. We can end this cleanly, maturely. Claire studied him for a long breath, the way one might study a stranger wearing a familiar face. She had lived with him so long that she could decode his emotions before he voiced them. But now she realized something unsettling. This wasn't a man collapsing into regret. It was a man collapsing into fear of losing control. Fear, not remorse. Fear, not understanding. Fear, not love. And that realization brought with it a clarity so sharp it almost hurt. She walked past him and entered the hallway, the one lined with faded photos, mismatched frames, and hand-painted canvases she'd collected from local artists over the years. She ran her fingers along the frames lightly. The dust felt like history gathering itself for testimony. Halfway down the hall, she paused at a particular frame. A photograph of her and her father standing on the porch, freshly painted behind them. She was smiling with teeth, eyes bright, hair wind-tossed. Her father's hand rested on her shoulder, grounding her with quiet pride. Looking at it now, the girl in the photo seemed impossibly young. The father seemed impossibly close. She whispered internally, "I'm still your daughter. I'm still holding everything you taught me." Then she turned back toward the living room. The girlfriend was gone, or rather, had retreated to the corner of the dining room, shrinking back as though trying to become as invisible as her conscience. She held her purse against her chest like a shield. Her hands trembled. Not from fear of Claire, but from waking up inside a lie she hadn't seen coming. Claire approached her slowly. "You don't have to apologize," she said. "But you do need to leave this house tonight." The girl nodded without protest. She seemed suddenly small, not in stature, but in presence, like someone realizing their reflection was painted by a stranger's narrative. Claire stepped back, giving her space to slip by. The girl hesitated, then pulled out a necklace from her pocket, a delicate chain with a pendant shaped like a key. "This was his," she whispered. "He gave it to me a week ago. Told me it meant commitment." Claire stared at the necklace, a symbol that once would have carried weight, now hollow with misplaced promise. The girl placed it gently on the entry table like a fragile truth she didn't want to carry anymore. Then she walked out the door without looking back. The moment it closed behind her, the house exhaled, a long soft breath released after too many held in silence. Mark heard the door shut. A flicker of shock passed over his face. "You made her leave?" he demanded, trying to rebuild a sense of authority. "You don't get to dictate," but Claire lifted her hand slightly, and his words died on the air. "Stop pretending you're the victim in a story you authored," she said softly. Mark opened his mouth again, but nothing came out. The truth had finally wrapped its hands around his throat. Claire walked past him and placed the folder, the one holding the real legal documents, on the dining table. She felt the gravity settle as though the house itself understood the significance of those pages being placed on that wood. She opened the folder slowly. Each paper rustled with the weight of her father's foresight, every clause carved in the ink of old wisdom. Mark hovered near the doorway, torn between leaving and staying, torn between pride and panic, torn between the world he thought he built and the truth that was dismantling it piece by piece. Claire leaned over the table, fingers brushing the embossed seal on the trust document. "This house," she said, not looking up, "has never been a symbol of our marriage. It has always been a symbol of my father's protection. And he protected me from exactly this scenario. You trying to take what was never yours." Mark's jaw flexed. He inhaled sharply, but she continued before he could interrupt. "You didn't just betray me," she said. "You tried to erase the one gift my father left for me to stand on when the rest of the world felt unsteady." Her voice softened, but the softness carried steel beneath it. "You tried to turn my inheritance into a weapon, but all you really did was expose the emptiness inside you." A tremor rippled through Mark's chest, not emotional but defensive, the kind of tremor that comes when someone realizes their armor has cracked too wide to hide behind anymore. He stepped forward, trying to recover ground he had never stood on. "You're blowing this up," he said. "We can still settle this. We can divide the assets fairly. You get your share, I get mine. That's how divorce works." Claire finally lifted her head, and her eyes met his with a stillness that made the room tilt. "No," she said gently. "That's how divorce works when both people acted in good faith." She straightened. "You didn't." A pulse of silence followed, sharp, clean, final. Claire closed the folder and slid it aside. She didn't need it for the next part. She had something more powerful than legal documents now. Clarity. She walked into the kitchen, where the faint scent of rosemary and lemon dish soap lingered. She remembered cooking here with Mark in the early days, when he used to laugh easily, when he would slide up behind her and wrap his arms around her waist while she chopped vegetables. She remembered the tenderness that once lived in these walls. But tenderness that turns into cruelty isn't tenderness at all. It's abandonment wearing a mask. She poured herself a glass of water and stared at the reflection on the kitchen window. Her face, calmer than she expected, softer than she thought she deserved to feel. Strength didn't always announce itself with fire. Sometimes it arrived like this, a quiet return to oneself. She heard footsteps behind her. She didn't turn. Mark leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, posture sinking into a strange mixture of resignation and resentment. "I loved you," he said. Claire took a slow sip of water and set the glass down gently. "No," she said. "You loved being loved. That's different." Mark blinked, the kind of blink that happens when truth lands squarely on the chest. She continued. "You loved the version of me who made your life easier. The version who forgave quickly. Who softened every edge. Who kept the peace even when you cracked it." She turned toward him now. "But as soon as life asked you to grow, you didn't want to. And when I stopped shrinking to make you feel bigger, you called it incompatibility. She stepped closer, her voice now a steady flame. You didn't fall out of love with me, Mark. You fell out of love with accountability. The room seemed to inhale at that. Mark looked away, swallowing hard. Claire moved past him, walking toward the staircase. She felt the steps beneath her, each one carrying years of memories she could now finally put into perspective. In the early days of her marriage, she used to run up these stairs laughing. Later, she climbed them slowly, silently, exhausted by the growing weight of becoming a stranger in her own home. But tonight, each step felt like reclaiming territory. At the top of the stairs, she paused and looked down the hallway. To the left was the bedroom she once shared with Mark, a room that held more arguments than dreams in the last few years. To the right was the guest room her father used when he stayed with her, its walls still holding the echo of his gentle voice. She chose the guest room, not as retreat, as remembrance, as rebirth. Walked inside, closing the door softly behind her. The room was quiet, lit only by the soft lamp in the corner. On the bedside table rested a small wooden box her father had carved, a box she hadn't opened in years. She sat on the bed, feeling the firmness of the mattress beneath her, grounding her. She opened the box. Inside lay letters, each one written in her father's careful, slanted handwriting. Letters he had left for her over the years. Some she knew the contents of, others she had read only once, then tucked away to protect herself from the ache they carried. But one envelope sat on top now, one she didn't recognize. The seal was unbroken. The paper slightly yellowed at the edges. Her breath caught. She lifted it gently and felt the weight of timing. The letter had waited for her. Waited for this moment. Her father had known she would need guidance not at the start of her marriage, but at the point where her life cracked open. She opened the envelope. Inside was a single page. His handwriting flowed like water. My Claire. If you are reading this, it means life has asked you to be braver than you expected. Remember this. A house is not wood and walls. It is a mirror. It shows you who you have become. And when you forget yourself, it reminds you. You are not lost. You are returning. Stand tall. Your roots are deeper than any storm. The words trembled in her hands, not because they were fragile, but because they were true. She pressed the paper to her chest, letting the message seep into every bruised corner of her spirit. Her father had given her a house, but more importantly, he had given her a way home to herself. She stayed in the room for a long time, letting grief and strength braid together, letting the old pain slip through her fingers so new life could take its place. Downstairs, she heard Mark opening drawers, slamming cabinets, pacing with frantic footsteps. He sounded for an escape hatch in a house that suddenly felt foreign, hostile, unforgiving. He sounded like a man being evicted by the truth. Claire didn't rush down. She didn't intervene. She let him unravel. Because unraveling isn't punishment. It's revelation. Eventually, the house quieted. Not because Mark found peace, but because he found reality. She returned downstairs, her father's letter folded gently in her hand. Mark stood at the front door with 2 bags packed, breathing hard. His face showed anger, shame, confusion, but beneath all that, an understanding he could no longer escape. He looked at her as though searching for the woman he had once known, the one who would soften, forgive, take him back. But she had returned to someone far older, far stronger, far truer. Herself. Mark swallowed. So this is it? Claire looked at him. Not with cruelty. Not with pity. But with a profound, unshakable truth. This, she said, is where the version of us you preferred ends. And where the version of me I deserve begins. Mark didn't reply. Didn't argue. Didn't bargain. He simply stepped outside. The door closed behind him with a soft thud. Not a slam. Not an echo. Just a quiet punctuation mark at the end of a chapter that should have ended years ago. Claire locked the deadbolt gently. Not to keep him out, but to keep herself in. The house felt different now. Fuller. Lighter. Breathing again. She walked to the living room, sat on the couch, and placed her father's letter beside her. The night wrapped itself around the house, still and patient, as if waiting for her next breath. And for the first time in years, Claire didn't feel abandoned. She felt found. She looked at the walls, the floors, the windows, the shadows, and whispered, I'm home. For years, Claire had imagined that if her marriage ever ended, it would sound like breaking glass. She thought it would be loud, catastrophic, the kind of hole where her life used to be. But the night Mark left, the house did not shatter. It exhaled. Silence filled the rooms like a tide returning to shore after years of being held back by a dam someone forgot to admit was cracked. It was not the lonely silence she had feared. It was an open, waiting kind of quiet, the kind that asks gently, "What do you want this place to be now? Who do you want to be inside it?" She slept that night in the guest room, under the watchful hush of her father's memory. The letter he had written lay on the bedside table, the ink still steady, the words still true. Every time she woke and saw it, a soft reassurance settled into her bones. She had not been abandoned to chaos. She had been escorted to truth. Morning arrived without ceremony. No alarm, no rush, no husband slamming doors or muttering about meetings. Light entered through the thin curtains, soft and unhurried, painting long streaks across the floor. For a few seconds she simply lay there and listened to the house waking up. The heater hummed its familiar low note. Pipes whispered as they carried warm water to places that needed it. A bird hopped along the gutter outside, its tiny claws tapping a casual rhythm above her. Distantly, a garbage truck sighed its way down the street, lifting other people's discarded things. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. She rose slowly, her movements cautious, not because she was afraid, but because she recognized that she was stepping into a new version of her life, and she wanted to meet it with intention. Her feet hit the floor. It held. She thanked it silently. In the bathroom, she caught her own reflection and paused. The woman looking back at her had the same eyes, the same hair, the same familiar soft lines at the corners of her mouth. But something was different behind the face. There was a quiet steadiness there now. The kind that comes after you have seen someone try to bury you and discovered, to your surprise, that you were rooted deeper than they knew. She made coffee the way she always had. This time the small domestic act felt like a ceremony of reclaiming. The kettle sang, the grounds bloomed, the scent rose, warm and bitter and truthful. She poured one mug, not two, and sat at the kitchen table her father had once sanded and stained. Her phone lay in the center of the table, face down. It had become the carrier of other people's needs over the years. Today it felt like a tool that waited for her instructions. When she finally picked it up, messages flooded the screen. Mia, her neighbor, sending 3 separate texts. "Are you okay? I heard him slam the car door. If you need a place to breathe, come over." A number from her lawyer. "Call me when you wake. We have ground to stand on." A string of missed calls from Mark late into the night. No voicemails. Just red circles and silence, the language of a man who suddenly realized the stage had been taken away before he finished his performance. She did not call him back. Not out of spite, but out of clarity. Some conversations are not bridges. They are traps disguised as apologies. Instead, she called her lawyer. The voice on the other end greeted her not with pity, but with respect. He had known her father. Had once watched him sign the papers that built this protection around her like a fortress of ink and intention. He spoke plainly now, which was its own kindness. They went through everything, the fraudulent attempt to sell the house, the unauthorized occupancy, the forged intent. Every detail became a thread in a net she could stand on. Every clause her father had insisted on years ago revealed itself as a hand reaching through time to steady her. "We have options," the lawyer said. "Real options. You are not at his mercy. In fact, legally, he has placed himself at yours." Mercy. The word landed strangely. It did not taste like revenge. Tasted like choice. After the call, Claire sat in the quiet for a long time. She could feel anger prowling at the edges of her mind, asking to be let in, promising a satisfying burn. She could feel bitterness lurking nearby too, offering to wallpaper the walls if she let it. But another feeling stepped forward, gentler, older, surprisingly strong resolve. She stood, rinsed her cup, and began to move through the house with new eyes. In the living room, she saw the indentation on the couch where Mark had sat the night before. It was still there, a shallow depression in the cushion. For a moment she stared at it, then pressed her palm into the fabric, smoothing it out. The act felt small and monumental at the same time. She would not preserve absences. She would not let his exit become a shrine. On the shelf, the picture of her and her father that had been turned face down now stood upright again, its glass catching the morning light. She took a breath and did something she had never allowed herself to do before. She smiled back at that younger version of herself in the photo, not with nostalgia, but with gratitude. You did the best you could with what you knew, she thought. And now you know more. She went to the bedroom she used to share with Mark, opened the closet, and saw his clothes still hanging in neat rows. The sight of them used to hurt. Today they felt like answered questions. She took down a box from the top shelf and began to fill it. Not frantically. Not with rage. Carefully. Shirts folded. Ties rolled. Socks paired. Every object she placed in the box became a sentence of closure. These things belonged to a life that no longer existed. They could travel with him into whatever story he tried to build next. They did not belong to the woman she was becoming. By noon, 4 boxes stood by the front door. She sent him a simple text. Your belongings are packed. You can pick them up tomorrow between 10 and 12. I will not be here. It was not cruelty. It was a boundary. The response came faster than she expected. Fine. I will send someone. The old Claire might have felt a sting at that. Might have translated it into rejection, into one last twist of his indifference. The new Claire read it as data and put her phone down. A man who did not have the courage to face the consequences of his own actions would not have access to her presence anymore. She would not become the stage for his discomfort. Afternoon drifted in, bringing with it a soft, diffused light and the low hum of life beyond her walls. Children rode their bikes down the street. A dog barked at a passing mail carrier. A couple argued quietly over yard work next door. All of it swirled around her house, ordinary and unremarkable. Inside, something extraordinary was happening in slow motion. She walked back to the small office her father had used, a place that had lived in the shadow of grief for too long. Dust lay on the desk in thin, even layers, as if time had been settling gently there in her absence. She opened the window. Air rushed in, cool and earnest, ruffling papers and lifting the edges of old envelopes. She sat at the desk and pulled out a notebook, the one she had purchased years ago with the intention of writing, then set aside under the weight of busyness and emotional fatigue. The pages were still blank. Blank did not scare her anymore. Blank was possibility. She uncapped a pen and wrote the date at the top of the first page. Her hand hesitated for only a heartbeat before the words began to flow. She did not begin with "Dear Diary." She did not begin with his name. She began with her own. My name is Claire, she wrote. And today, in the house my father built to protect me, I am finally ready to tell the truth about what I have survived. The pen moved slower at first, then steadily, as if the story had been waiting at the threshold of her fingers for years. She wrote about the early days of the marriage, the library smiles, the promises that once felt like sturdy stepping stones. She wrote about the infertility, the way the silence of an empty nursery had lodged itself in her lungs. She wrote about the creeping change in Mark's eyes, the late nights, the dismissive jokes, the subtle cruelty that had grown more comfortable in the spaces where kindness used to live. She did not dramatize. She did not excuse. She simply told the truth, sentence by sentence, letting the ink absorb what her voice had not been allowed to say. At some point she realized she was not writing just for herself. Her words had begun to tilt toward someone she had never met. The woman who would one day think she was the only one. The woman who would be sitting in a house that suddenly felt like a courtroom, wondering how she had become the accused in her own life. She wrote for her. You are not weak for staying longer than you should have, Claire wrote. You are not foolish for believing him when he said he loved you. You are not pathetic for wanting the dream more than the evidence. You are human. And humans are allowed to want to be loved. Tears pricked her eyes then, finally, not with the jagged sharpness of shock, but with the soft ache of release. One fell onto the page, smudging a word. She did not wipe it away. Letting her pain touch the story made it more honest, not less. When she finally looked up, the light in the room had changed again. Late afternoon had slipped in unnoticed, washing the walls in a deeper honeyed warmth. Outside, the sky was beginning to consider evening. Inside, Claire closed the notebook gently and placed her pen on top of it. This, she realized, was another kind of ownership. Not of property. Of narrative. Her father had made sure she would never lose the house. She would make sure she never lost herself again. The next days unfolded not in dramatic bursts, but in deliberate steps. She met with her lawyer in person. They sat at a polished conference table, surrounded by quiet stacks of paper and the distant murmurs of other people's battles. He spread out the documents in front of her and walked her through everything. There were the clauses that protected her, the laws that backed her, the avenues they could pursue: fraud, attempted transfer of property without consent, possible damages. He spoke calmly, giving her information, not instructions. She appreciated that. For too long, she had lived inside a life where someone else's voice told her what reality was. This time she wanted facts, not narratives. "I do not want to ruin him," she said at one point, surprising even herself as the words emerged. "I just want the truth to be acknowledged. And I want my home and my name cleared of his actions." The lawyer nodded slowly. "Justice is not the same as destruction," he replied. "It is simply reality documented." They moved forward carefully. Notices were sent. Records were pulled. The so-called buyer of the house, a distant investor who had never even visited it, responded with confusion and then anger upon learning that the property had been misrepresented. "You are not the one in danger here," the lawyer reminded her gently. "He is." Word traveled in quiet ways, slipping through professional circles, whispering along the edges of reputations. The real estate agent who had been all too eager to push the deal through found himself facing scrutiny. His emails were reviewed, his shortcuts uncovered. His excuses sounded thin under the weight of recorded calls and missing signatures. Mark tried to spin it, of course. He called her several times, each voicemail a different attempt at control. On one, he was angry, telling her she was taking things too far. On another, he sounded wounded, implying that she had misunderstood his intentions. In a third, he tried nostalgia, reminding her of their early years, as if that history could be a shield against consequence. She listened to them once. Then she saved them. Not because she wanted to replay them, but because they were evidence not just for any case but for her own heart. Proof of how many shapes manipulation could take when it was desperate. She replied only once in writing through her lawyer. "All communication regarding legal matters will proceed through counsel." It was more than a sentence. It was a locked door. Outwardly, her life settled into a new rhythm. Inwardly, it was undergoing a renovation. Not the kind with noise and dust and strangers tramping through with heavy boots. The quieter kind where walls are repainted, furniture moved, air renewed. She walked the neighborhood in the mornings now. Not because she needed to escape her house, but because she wanted to return to it with fresh lungs. The same sidewalks she had paced while worrying about his late nights now felt like corridors of possibility. She noticed things she had ignored before. The way the maple on the corner leaned slightly, as if listening to passers-by, the crack in the pavement that someone had filled with wildflowers, the old woman 3 houses down who always sat on her porch knitting, watching the world with content curiosity. One morning as she passed, the woman lifted a hand in greeting. Claire smiled back and stopped, pulled by an impulse she might once have suppressed. They talked. Not about husbands or court cases or betrayal. About simple things. Weather. Gardens. The best time to plant bulbs. The neighbor's dog who always escaped when the gate was not latched properly. "You look different," the woman said at last, eyes kind. "Lighter. Like someone took a heavy coat off your shoulders when you were not looking." Claire blinked at that, surprised at how accurately a stranger could read what she had barely begun to name. "Maybe I finally realized it was not my coat," she replied. The woman nodded like she understood more than she was saying. Back at home, the changes continued. She moved Mark's remaining papers into a single box, not to them but to contain them. She replaced the neutral painting above the mantel with one of her own photographs, a shot she had taken years ago on a solo trip she had almost canceled because he argued it was unnecessary. The picture showed an empty shoreline at dawn, the horizon washed in pale gold, a place where the world was still deciding what kind of day it wanted to be. One evening she pulled out a yellow folder from the back of a drawer, an old business plan she had written in her early 30s and then put away. Back then, she had dreamed of starting her own small real estate consultancy, specializing in helping women navigate property, inheritance, and legal complexities, so they would never be blindsided the way her mother had been when her own father died without a will. She had shown that folder to Mark once. He had skimmed it, patted her hand and said, "It is a nice idea, but the market is saturated." And you are comfortable where you are, right? Why risk it? She had believed him. Or maybe she had believed that her dreams needed his approval to be valid. Now, sitting at her father's old desk with a lamp casting a patient circle of light around her, she opened the folder again. The words still made sense. The need still existed. If anything, she understood it more deeply now. She picked up a pen and started updating the plan, line by line, not as fantasy but as intention. Her father had protected her with paper and foresight. She could do the same for others. As the days became weeks, the legal process moved forward. It did not race. It did not drag. It proceeded at the steady pace of systems that, however flawed, were still designed to eventually favor the truth. Mark's attempted sale was officially voided. The fraudulent documents were flagged. The buyer, now aggressively displeased, redirected his anger where it belonged. The real estate agent's license hung in the balance. And Mark found himself facing potential charges he had never thought possible. He tried new tactics then through intermediaries. Mutual acquaintances reached out with soft voices. Maybe you could drop the complaints. Do you really want to ruin his career? He is saying you are overreacting. That it was just a misunderstanding. But she had spent years shrinking her pain to fit inside someone else's comfort. That era was over. He almost took my home, she replied calmly when pressured. He tried to sell what did not belong to him and laughed while doing it. His career is not my responsibility. His choices are. The word spread not like gossip but like a verdict. One afternoon months later, she passed a cafe and saw him through the glass. He sat alone at a small table, talking to someone across from him. The confident tilt of his shoulders was gone. His suit looked a little too stiff, like a costume that no longer fit the man underneath. There were lines around his mouth she did not remember. She could have walked in, could have forced a confrontation, could have delivered one last cutting sentence and watched him flinch. Instead, she watched him for a moment, then kept walking. His story with her was over. Her story with herself was not. At home, she found a letter in the mailbox, official stamped, carrying the weight of completion. The investigation had concluded. His actions had been documented, recorded, categorized. Accountability had been assigned. She sat at the kitchen table, opened the envelope, and read every line. Not quickly, not hungrily, carefully. When she finished, she did not feel vindicated fireworks. She felt something quieter, something more sacred. Closure. The house around her sat still, listening. She placed the letter beside her father's on the table. Two different genres of protection side by side, one written in affection, one written in formal language. She ran a finger over both. I am safe, she thought. Not because he is punished, but because I finally chose myself. That night, she stood at the back door, looking out at the garden. The sky was clear, stars stitched across it in soft, patient patterns. The rosemary bushes moved slightly in the wind, releasing their scent. She stepped outside, bare feet against the cool ground, and walked to the tree her father had planted when he first gave her the keys. It had grown taller over the years, branches spreading in a wide, protective arc. She rested her hand against the trunk. I stayed too long with someone who forgot how to see me, she acknowledged in the quiet of her mind. But I did not abandon myself. I was simply delayed in returning. The wind answered by lifting a strand of her hair, brushing it back from her face like a gentle hand. Behind her, through the window, she could see the glow of the lamp in the small office. On the desk, her updated business plan lay open. Next to it, her notebook waiting for the next chapter she would write. The house, once the site of attempted erasure, had become the place where she began again. This was not the ending Mark had imagined when he laughed on the phone and declared her life over. It was not an ending at all. It was Act 6. The act where a woman looks around at the ruins someone else tried to leave her in, and realizes they are not ruins. They are raw materials. And she has always known how to build. When the dust of survival finally settles, something strange happens. The silence that once felt heavy begins to feel holy. That was the quiet Claire woke into now, weeks after the storm of betrayal had passed. Not the abrupt, stunned quiet of shock, but the grounded, rhythmic quiet of healing. A quiet that made her aware of every small sound her house made, each one familiar yet newly meaningful, like a language she had always spoken but never truly listened to. The refrigerator hummed in its usual tone, but instead of blending into the background, it sounded like a living heartbeat. The soft tick of the wall clock no longer counted down the minutes until Mark's return or measured the hours of loneliness in a collapsing marriage. It now felt like the world's simplest reminder: you are here. You are still moving. The seconds belong to you again. She sat on her back porch with a cup of chamomile tea, steam rising into the crisp morning air, carrying with it her exhale long, steady, and uncluttered. The air felt new. Maybe it wasn't, but she was. The rosemary bushes swayed gently in the breeze, and in that small motion Claire recognized something important. She had become a woman the wind could no longer push over. The legal matters were progressing with predictable slowness, but that no longer stressed her. She had documents protecting her, truth on her side, and a lawyer who spoke to her like an equal partner, not a fragile client. What she didn't have anymore, and didn't want, was the weight of Mark's shadow bleeding into her decisions. She had finally stepped out of that darkness, one slow, consistent step at a time. Her mornings became rituals of reclaiming. She would open every curtain in the house, letting sunlight pour in boldly, as though she were inviting the day inside rather than hiding from it. She swept the floors not because they needed sweeping, but because the act itself reminded her she was maintaining a home that belonged fully to her. She moved furniture, small changes at first. A couch angled differently, a lamp relocated, photographs reframed. These shifts refreshed her rooms, making the familiar feel gently unfamiliar, like a house rediscovering itself after being misnamed for years. One afternoon, she rolled up the rug under the coffee table and dragged it outside to beat the dust from it. A silly thing, perhaps, something she normally would have hired help for. But swinging that rug over the porch railing and smacking it repeatedly with a broom felt cathartic in a way therapy couldn't replicate. Dust flew up in the light, swirling like tiny ghosts leaving her house at last. She laughed, a sudden genuine sound that startled even her. It sounded like a woman tasting her own freedom. After the rug cleaning triumph, she moved to larger changes. She painted a wall in the dining room, a deep, earthy green her father would have approved of. She brought home plants. A fiddle leaf fig taller than she was. Snake plants. Succulents. Bits of life placed intentionally in corners Mark used to neglect. Healing became visible. Every room began to breathe again. Every surface started to feel honest. The house was becoming a mirror of her becoming. But reconstruction isn't just about paint and furniture. It's about the quiet moments when the heart acknowledges what it survived. Those came too, sometimes at unexpected hours. Like the evening she stood at the kitchen sink washing tea mugs and suddenly remembered her wedding day with startling clarity. The trembling vows, the hopeful eyes, the naive belief that love was enough to outrun insecurity. She didn't collapse under the memory. She simply nodded to it, acknowledging the girl she once was. "Thank you," she whispered to that version of herself. "You carried me far." And she let the memory dissolve into the steam rising from the sink. On another night, she found herself sorting old photographs. She had expected to feel bitterness when she found the ones with Mark, vacations, holidays, anniversaries. Instead, she felt something else: distance. Distance is its own kind of healing. It tells you that you no longer live inside that version of your life. She placed the photographs face down in a box labeled archive and slid it onto the top shelf of the closet. Not thrown away, not erased, simply categorized. She refused to let her past hold power over her present. One of the quiet triumphs of survival is learning that not everything needs to be burned. Some things simply need to be put back in their appropriate place. While her inner world was rebuilding, the outer world began to shift too. Word of Mark's attempted fraud traveled slowly but inevitably, not like gossip whispered through neighborhoods, but like a controlled burn carried through professional circles. People who had once praised his confidence now spoke of his recklessness. Associates who once admired his ambition now questioned his ethics. He wasn't ruined, but he was revealed. And revelation is its own punishment. Claire didn't revel in his unraveling. She didn't track updates obsessively. When her lawyer emailed her new developments, she read them with a steady heart and a clear mind. Her life no longer revolved around what Mark did or did not do. He had become a small character in a story where she was finally the protagonist. Still, life has a way of bringing closure in unexpected packages. One afternoon, She walked into a local hardware store for paint samples and brushes. The bell chimed overhead. The smell of sawdust and metal filled her lungs with familiarity. Her father used to take her to places like this. It felt like stepping into an old memory with new eyes. While she compared paint swatches, she sensed movement beside her. She turned. It was Mark. Older somehow. Less polished. A man whose certainty had cracked in too many places to hide. He looked startled. Embarrassed. As if he'd been caught doing something he wasn't proud of, existing perhaps. For a moment they simply stood there, two people bound by history but no longer connected by destiny. He opened his mouth, preparing a speech he must have rehearsed. But Claire lifted a hand gently, stopping him before he could turn their crossing into another performance. "Don't," she said softly. "Not cruel. Not cold. Just honest." Mark swallowed. "I just wanted to say." Claire tilted her head, patient but unmoved. "You wanted to say sorry," she said. "And I appreciate that. But you're not saying it for me. You're saying it because you need relief from the guilt you earned." His face tightened at that. Not in anger, in recognition. He looked down at the paint sample in his hand. "I'm trying to start over," he murmured. "I hope you do," she replied. "But don't rewrite what happened to make your new beginning easier. Learn from it. That's the only apology that matters." He looked up then, eyes softening with something like humility, or maybe defeat. And then in a quiet voice stripped of arrogance, "You look happier." She didn't smile. She simply said, "I am." And she walked away, not dramatically, not triumphantly, but peacefully, the way one leaves a chapter whose pages have finally turned. Back home, she placed the new paintbrushes on the dining table and stood in the doorway of the office her father once used. The sunlight hit the desk at a perfect angle, warm and golden. Her business plan lay open. Her notebook lay beside it. A mug she had painted as a child rested on the corner, crooked hearts and uneven stars, her father's favorite reminder that imperfection could still be precious. She sat down, opened her laptop and began writing emails, one to a local women's shelter, offering free consultations on property rights and housing security. One to a small business incubator submitting her application for a grant. One to herself, a digital letter titled What I Know Now, which she planned to open next year. As she typed, she realized something beautiful. The house no longer felt like a place where she survived him. It felt like a place where she discovered herself. Weeks passed. The trees outside changed color. Mornings grew cooler. She found herself sitting on the porch more often, wrapped in a blanket her mother gave her decades ago. She watched life swirl around her, cars passing, neighbors waving, the world moving like it always had, indifferent and kind in equal measure. And inside her a new world was forming. Not all at once. Not in dramatic moments. But quietly. Consistently. The way a garden returns each spring, stubborn and sure. She wasn't just healing. She was growing. She wasn't just rebuilding. She was expanding. She wasn't just surviving. She was becoming. And one evening, while she stood at the back door watching the last arc of sunset dip behind the horizon, she whispered a truth she never thought she would reach. "I love the woman I am becoming." The house heard it. The garden echoed it. And her father's spirit, still rooted in every corner of the home he protected for her, seemed to whisper back, "I always knew you would." There is a moment in every rebuilding when the walls stop feeling temporary and begin to feel like home again. For Claire, that moment arrived not with a burst of celebration, but with the quiet click of a send button on an email that carried more of her journey than she realized. She had been sitting at her father's old desk, afternoon light spilling over the keyboard in a soft spill of gold. The house was still, the kind of still that feels cooperative rather than empty. On the screen in front of her sat an email draft addressed to a local community center, a simple offer written plainly. She was volunteering to host a free workshop for women on understanding home ownership, legal protections, and the quiet dangers of trusting someone else to handle the paperwork. Her finger hovered over the mouse, not because she doubted her ability, but because she understood what this meant. Once she stepped into this role, she would no longer be just a woman who survived a betrayal. She would be a woman who turned that survival into a map for others. She pressed send. The message flew into the invisible channels of the digital world, small and unassuming, yet carrying within it the seed of something much larger, a new purpose. The reply came quicker than expected. The center director wrote back with enthusiasm, gratitude, and a surprising urgency. There were more women than they could count, she said, who had been through versions of what Claire had endured. Some had lost homes. Some had lost inheritance. Some had never even known what they were entitled to. We don't just need your expertise, the director wrote. We need your story. The word lingered in Claire's chest longer than the rest of the email. Her story. For years, her story had felt like something that happened to her. Now it was becoming something she could offer. The workshop was scheduled for a Saturday morning 2 weeks later. In the days leading up to it, Claire prepared with the same diligence she once reserved for clients and closings. She drafted outlines. She collected sample contracts, deeds, and trust documents. She created simple slides that explained complicated concepts without condescension, but each time she rehearsed, she found herself drifting away from the bullet points and into something softer, more powerful memory. The moment she sat in the lawyer's office with her father as he insisted the house be placed solely in her name. The way Mark's voice sounded when he laughed on the phone, announcing her supposed displacement like it was a clever twist in a play. The feel of the deed paper beneath her fingers on the night she realized she was not helpless. She realized that the legal facts were important, but they were not the reason women would remember what she said. They would remember how it felt to hear someone describe out loud the shape of a trap they themselves had been caught in. The morning of the workshop, she dressed simply. No armor. No costume. A soft blouse. Comfortable trousers. A necklace her mother once wore, the chain warmed by generations of skin. She left the house with a folder of documents under her arm and a copy of her father's letter tucked into the inside pocket of her bag, not because she planned to read it to anyone, but because it had become her quiet talisman. The community center smelled faintly of coffee, printer ink, and the kind of busy hope that fills places built for public good. A volunteer at the front desk gave her a name tag and led her down a hall toward a modest room where chairs had been arranged in a loose semicircle. Women filtered in gradually. Some alone. Some in pairs. Some carrying notebooks. Some carrying only the tension of stories they were not yet ready to say out loud. They sat with guarded faces at first, eyes wary, shoulders tight. The air hummed with the slight awkwardness that arises whenever people gather for something that hints at pain. Claire stood at the front of the room and did something she had not done in a very long time. She introduced herself with her full truth. My name is Claire, she began, voice steady, and I'm here because my husband once called me while I was out of town and told me he'd already sold our house and was divorcing me. He laughed when he said it. He thought I would crumble. What he didn't know was that the house had never been his to sell. The room shifted. Eyes lifted. A ripple of recognition passed across the faces in front of her, not because they had lived that exact moment, but because they had all, in their own ways, been blindsided by people who thought their power was absolute. She watched their shoulders loosen just slightly. She went on not to sensationalize but to contextualize. She described her father's decision to protect her, the paperwork he'd put in place, the way that single act had saved her from losing not just a building but a sanctuary. Then she widened the story, shifting from her own experience into the broader patterns she'd begun to see. Some of you, she said, were told that love meant not asking questions about money. Some of you were told you were being negative when you wanted to understand what you were signing. Some of you were raised to believe that talking about assets was greedy or unromantic. So you stayed quiet. She let that last sentence hang in the air. And some of you, she added gently, are paying or have paid the price for that silence. Heads nodded now. Hands tightened around pins. A few eyes glistened. Claire moved from story into structure, walking them through the basics of deeds, co-ownership, prenuptial agreements, wills, beneficiary designations, and trusts. She kept her language simple, her tone respectful. She did not speak down to them. She spoke across to them, as someone who had once not known what she now knew. Every so often, she would return to a personal detail, not to make herself the center, but to remind them that this information wasn't theoretical. This clause here, she said once, pointing at a highlighted section, was the reason my husband's forged attempt to sell my house didn't stand. Without it, his lie could have become my reality. She watched the realization bloom on their faces, the idea that a line of text could be the difference between displacement and protection. During a break, a woman with gray streaks in her hair approached, hands twisted together. "I didn't lose my house," she said, almost apologetically, as if her question needed justification. "But when my brother died, his girlfriend walked away with everything because I didn't know we needed anything in writing. I thought family meant we agreed on what was fair." She swallowed. "I don't want my daughters to go through what I did." Claire listened the way her father used to listen, with still eyes and a steady presence. "Then they won't," she said. "Because you're here. Because you'll prepare them. Because you'll tell them that wanting clarity is not mistrust. It's care." The woman blinked fast, then nodded with a gratitude that went past words. Later, another woman, younger, approached her in the hallway. "I'm still with him," she admitted in a rush. "He's not as bad as, Not yet. But he doesn't let me see anything. Says I wouldn't understand. Says it's his burden. Sometimes I feel crazy for wanting to know. Like I'm being nosy or ungrateful." Claire met her eyes. "You're not crazy," she said. "You're awake." The woman exhaled shakily. You could see something realigning behind her eyes, an axis shifting. "This," Claire added softly, "isn't just about protecting yourself in case something goes wrong. It's about standing inside your life fully, not as a guest, but as a co-owner. Of the home. Of the decisions. Of your future." By the end of the workshop, the room felt different. The women didn't leave hurriedly. They lingered, talking quietly with one another, comparing notes, sharing stories with half-sentences that the others somehow fully understood. A community had formed in those few hours, not by design but by truth. As Claire packed up her materials, the director of the center came up to her, eyes bright. "You have to come back," she said. "We've never seen them so engaged with something that usually scares them. You made it feel possible." Possible. The word tasted good. On the drive home, Claire rolled down her window, letting cool air rush through the car and into her lungs. The streetlights flickered on one by one, like quiet witnesses to a new chapter. She passed houses with their windows lit, slices of other people's lives framed in rectangles of warm light. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was on the outside looking in. She felt like she was one of the people inside, living fully. Back at home, she set her folder down on the dining table and walked straight to the garden. The sky was dark now, pricked with stars. She stood in the quiet and let the day settle through her system like gentle rain. She thought about the women in that room. The way their expressions had shifted from guarded to receptive. The way some had walked out straighter, as if the information had added inches to their spine. She realized something then. Her father had protected her not just for her sake, but because he believed she would one day do something with the safety he gave her. Not to stay small inside a safe box, but to stand tall and open doors for others. Her pain had not been pointless. Her survival was not just for her. It was a blueprint. In the months that followed, the work grew. The community center asked her back, then another organization invited her to speak. A women's shelter. A legal aid group. A small podcast that focused on financial literacy reached out. Someone in one of the audiences recorded a short, shaky video of her explaining how to read the top of a property deed, and the clip circulated quietly online, reaching people far beyond her city. She started getting emails from strangers. A woman in another state who had just discovered her husband had mortgaged their paid-off home without telling her. A single mother trying to buy a small condo and scared to sign anything. A daughter whose parents were aging and had never written a will. Claire did not have all the answers, and she never pretended to. But she had learned how to point people in the right direction. How to give questions instead of prescriptions. Ask who is on the title. Ask what happens if one of you dies. Ask what you are signing before you pick up the pen. She started a simple website from her kitchen table, just a few pages at first. An about section that told her story in a measured, dignified way. A resources page with templates, checklists, definitions. A contact form for those seeking consultations. She named her small consultancy Rooted Title. The phrase captured everything: her father's gift, her own transformation, the kind of security she wanted others to feel. To be rooted, not stuck but stabilized. To hold title not just on paper but in their own sense of belonging. Each time she saw the logo, drawn by a young designer from the community center, a small house whose foundation extended into roots. She felt a small flicker of joy. Not explosive, not theatrical. The quiet, grounded joy of doing something aligned with who she now realized she had always been. A woman who protected. A woman who protected. A woman who explained. A woman who stood in complexity and translated it into courage. One rainy afternoon, as droplets tapped insistently on the windows like impatient fingers, Claire sat in the living room with a mug of tea and her notebook. The pages were now filled. Story, reflections, fragments of conversations, small epiphanies she didn't want to lose. She flipped to a fresh section titled, Things I Want to Remember. She wrote, "Remember that the night he called to say he'd sold the house was not the night your life ended. It was the night your real life began. Remember that your worth is not located in who chooses you, but in how you choose yourself. Remember that protection given in love carries a responsibility, to live fully, not cautiously. Remember that there are women who will never meet your father, but will feel the impact of his love through you." The rain grew heavier. She let it. Her house stood firm, the sound of it like applause on the roof. Later that evening, Mia knocked on her door, holding a Tupperware container filled with something that smelled like cinnamon and butter. She came in chattering about the neighborhood, about a broken mailbox, about the teenager down the block who had started shoveling driveways for extra money. At one point she paused mid-sentence looking around. "This place feels different," she said. "Lighter. Bigger somehow." "It hasn't grown," Claire replied with a small smile. Mia shrugged. "Maybe you have. And the house is just keeping up." After she left, Claire walked to the center of the living room and turned slowly, taking it all in, the green dining room wall, the plants, the new photographs, the absence of his things, the presence of her own choices. She understood something then that settled into her bones as truth. The house had been waiting for this version of her all along. Her father hadn't given a home to the young, hopeful bride who didn't yet know her own strength. He had given it to the woman she would one day become, the one who could stand in rooms full of strangers and say, "This is what he tried to take from me, and this is how I kept it." Not with vengeance. With knowledge. With boundaries. With the quiet, stubborn, ordinary courage of waking up each day and choosing not to shrink. Sometime, near the end of that first full year after the call that changed everything, she drove out to the cemetery where her parents were buried. The sky was a bruised gray, the kind of color that makes the world smell like wet soil and forgiveness. She brought no flowers. Her parents had never been flower people. They had been fix the fence people. Pay the bill early people. Make sure you have what you need when we're gone people. She stood before their stone and slipped her hand into her coat pocket. Her fingers brushed against the folded paper she had brought with her, a copy of her first workshop flyer. She unfolded it and placed it gently at the base of the headstone, weighed down with a small stone. "I used to think you protected me because you didn't trust the world," she murmured internally. "Now I know you protected me because you trusted that I would do something with the safety you gave me." The wind moved through the trees overhead, brushing branches together in a sound like soft applause. She smiled, a small private thing. On her way back to the car, her phone buzzed. An email notification. Another organization wanted to schedule a talk. This one at a college for young women about to step into their first leases, first mortgages, first contracts, first promises. She accepted. As she drove home, the roads familiar beneath her tires, she realized that the story which began with her husband laughing about selling the house had become something so much larger than his cruelty. It had become a story about legacy, about preparation, about the quiet power of being ready for storms you hope never come. Mark had wanted to use surprise as a weapon. Her father had used foresight as a shield. And Claire, standing between them, had turned both into a path forward, not just for herself, but for everyone who would hear her voice and feel less alone, less naive, less ashamed. Her life no longer hinged on what had been taken from her. It was defined now by what she chose to build day by day, in the house he could not take, on the ground that had always belonged to her. Winter arrived quietly that year, not with a storm, not with abrupt cold, but with a slow deepening of the air. The mornings grew sharper. The evenings darkened earlier. The house, her house, began to take on a new kind of sacred stillness, the kind that comes when a life has finally stopped breaking and started mending. By now, Claire had settled into a rhythm so natural it felt as though she had been living this way her whole life. The consultancy was blooming slowly, humbly but undeniably. Women reached out daily, not for rescue but for clarity, for courage, for confirmation that they weren't crazy, for wanting to understand what they signed, what they owned, what they risked. Every email began the same way. I heard your story. She had become a lighthouse without meaning to. A steady beam in the dark. Not saving ships, just showing them where the rocks were. But for all the growth happening beyond her walls, the most profound transformation continued deep inside her. One night in early winter, as the wind roamed the edges of her house, Claire decided she was ready to reclaim the last room she had avoided, the master bedroom. The one she and Mark had shared. The one that had become a museum of old promises. A shrine to a woman who kept trying to shrink herself to fit a space that kept tightening around her. She opened the door. The room was still. Still in that heavy way old memories cling to walls. The bedspread she had once chosen for both of them sat crisp and untouched. The nightstands faced each other like silent witnesses to years of sleeping back to back, pretending nothing was wrong. She stepped inside. At first she simply stood there, letting the memories wash over her, soft ones, sharp ones, the ones she had buried and the ones she had carried like talismans. She remembered painting the wall a pale blue one summer because he said the color made him feel calm. She remembered reading novels under the blankets during nights he stayed out late. She remembered crying quietly in the bathroom once, careful, always careful, not to let her grief echo. She pressed a hand to her chest, steadying herself. Not anymore, she breathed internally. Then she went to work. She stripped the bed, removed the art she had never liked, opened the curtains fully, letting whatever moonlight existed pour in without permission. She dragged furniture aside, swept, dusted, opened windows to let winter air purge the stale remnants of old life. The room woke up. That night, she didn't sleep in the guest room. She made the master bed with fresh sheets, placed a vase of rosemary on the nightstand, one sprig for her father, one for her mother, one for the woman she had become. She lay down in the middle of the bed, not on her side, not careful, claiming the space fully. The room felt new. No, she felt new. She fell asleep easily, without the weight of someone else's expectations pressing into the mattress. In late winter, she received a letter in the mail bearing her lawyer's seal. Inside was the final update. The case had officially concluded. The fraudulent attempt to sell the house was fully documented. Legal protections had prevailed. No further action was required on her part. Mark had been fined, the agent disciplined, the attempted sale permanently voided. Her name, the one her father gave her, was clear, clean, intact. She sat on the porch with the letter in her hand, cold air brushing her cheeks. She read it twice, then folded it carefully, not out of sentimentality but out of respect for what it represented. Accountability. She didn't celebrate. She didn't even feel vindicated. She just felt whole. Mark had become a faded outline in her story, a figure in the background of a portrait whose focus had shifted. Sometimes closure doesn't slam doors. Sometimes it simply switches off the light in a room you should have left long ago. Spring announced itself with subtle hints. A bud on the rosemary, a warm afternoon disguised among colder days, a sense of something waking beneath the soil. One morning, Claire walked outside and found a tiny purple flower blooming beside the porch step. She hadn't planted it. Maybe it had arrived by wind or a bird or luck. She crouched and touched its petals. Nature has a way of insisting on renewal, she realized, even in places that once felt barren. Later that day, as she worked from the dining table with her laptop open, she received a message from the community center. A young woman, barely 20, had shown up asking specifically for her. The girl had tears in her eyes and a notebook in her hands. She had heard Claire speak months earlier and finally found the courage to leave a situation she described only as dark. She said your story gave her a way to see her own clearly, the message read. She wants to thank you. Claire closed her eyes for a moment, letting the words settle. Her story, the one that began with betrayal, collapse, the threat of displacement. Now it was a lifeline. She responded that she'd meet the girl the following afternoon. She prepared resources, documents, a list of safe contacts. But she also prepared something else, a truth she wished someone had told her. You are not broken for having trusted the wrong person. You are brave for choosing yourself after. Late one evening after the meeting with the girl, Claire returned home feeling both heavy and light, a combination she was learning to recognize as the growing pains of purpose. She lit a candle in the living room, sat on the floor beside the coffee table, opened her notebook, and began writing again, this time not about her pain but about her becoming. She wrote, I am no longer the woman who answered a phone call and heard her world fall apart. I am the woman who rebuilt everything with truth, with courage, and with the memory of my father standing quietly at my side. The house he gave me is no longer just a gift. It is a mission. Promise. A place where brokenness comes to understand it is temporary. When she finished, she placed the notebook beside her father's letter. The candle flickered softly, illuminating the edges of both pages. Her past, her becoming, side by side, not in conflict, in continuity. And on a night in early spring, as she stood at the back door watching the garden breathe in the moonlight, she realized something with quiet certainty. She had finally returned to herself, not to who she was before him, but to who she was meant to be after everything. The woman her father believed she would one day become. The woman her past could no longer diminish. The woman her future had been waiting for. Claire closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and let the truth settle into her bones. She was home, in every possible way. This is the story of the night her husband called laughing, telling her he had sold the house and was leaving her. He thought it was the end of her life. But the house knew better. The walls remembered the man who built them. The floorboards remembered the steps of a daughter he loved fiercely. The deed remembered the truth. And when she returned, broken, betrayed, trembling with clarity, the house recognized her. It opened its doors. It kept her safe. It burned away the lies that tried to claim it. It held her as she rebuilt not just rooms but identity. Not just a home but a purpose. A year later, she stood in the same doorway where he once tried to erase her, and realized she hadn't just survived the storm. She had become the woman the storm could never unmake. And in the quiet, as dawn spread its gentle gold across the walls, the house whispered the truth it had known from the very beginning. You were never leaving.